That's what I
cheese.
thought.
All right, so today we are going to finish talking about sort of the end of the history of evolutionary thought, and then we'll get into sort of some of the ideas Darwin proposed and some information about natural selection. So just to remind us of where we were, talked about the history of people's thinking on evolution. Is that there were cultures and there were philosophers and individuals that did propose the idea that species could change over time, okay, all the way back into ancient times. Throughout most of the Western world, in the Middle Ages and up into the Renaissance, most people, however, believed in special creation, that God created each of the species, that they were unchanging. They'd always been the way they are today, and they would always be the exact same in the future. Okay? And so, but then people started, and people believed the Earth was 6,000 years old. But then scientists in the 18th and 19th century started to question some of these ideas. One being the age of the Earth, and the other being that species could change over time. So Darwin was aware of these ideas. He was aware of the work of geologists that were saying the Earth is actually much older than 6,000 years old. He was aware of some of the work of other naturalists who talked about species changing. But Darwin's contribution and Wallace's contribution was that how those species changed through this process of natural selection. It was 1858 when Darwin and Wallace together presented their works on natural selection. And again, we just read some of their materials. We read the letters from the Linnean Society that was sort of helping to bring both of their sets of work together at the same time because they came up with their ideas independently. Darwin did come up with them first, but didn't publish them, didn't make them known to the rest of the scientific community widely until sort of Wallace sort of forced him to do that. So Darwin, as you know, traveled around the world on the HMS Beagle. He was young, he was only about 22 years old. He wasn't really sure what he wanted to do with his life. He thought about being a minister, thought about becoming a doctor and so forth, but never really settled on anything. Went on the Beagle. He wrote, this is the book, this is Voyage of the Beagle by Darwin. So he writes in this book all about his trip. He goes through sort of chronologically all the places he went, what he saw, of the people he interacted with, the animals, sort of what was going on. So that actually became a pretty well-known book, and he became a well-known scientist after that. In his travels around the world, he spent a lot of time in South America, on the east and the west coast, spent time in the Galapagos Islands, as well as Australia. And while visiting all these various places, he was studying and thinking about the huge variety of organisms that there were. Right? And this led him to formulate his ideas about natural selection, about how species evolve. He eventually did publish the work on the origin of the species in 1859. Here's the original cover. It became a hugely popular work with scientists and naturalists and people interested in science, and he became very well known, obviously, for the idea of natural selection. And natural selection is about how evolution happens. So Darwin's contribution wasn't making it known that species change over time. It was his description of how that could happen. This process that we now call natural selection, he called natural selection. So we kind of put these ideas into context historically by looking at kind of a timeline. So this is, the 1700s to the 1900s. And so if we look along this sort of timeline, we could sort of see things building. So 1795, Hutton Okay, you see Lyell here, who we read about from the Linnaean Society. They were geologists, and they were proposing the ideas that the Earth is much older than people thought, that the processes of geology are responsible for the long, slow changes that happen in the Earth over time. Malthus wrote his essay about population growth that Darwin read, that got him thinking about overproduction, okay, led him to thinking about survival of the fittest. Lamarck was writing about the evolution of species. He was the one that thought species could inherit traits that happened during their lifetime. He believed in like the stretching of the giraffe's neck. Wasn't correct in those ways, but was correct that species do change over time and evolve from previous species. Darwin traveled in the 1830s on the Beagle. He started writing about natural selection when he returned over the next several years. Okay, Wallace then sends his ideas to Darwin in 1858, prompting Darwin to publish Origin of the Species. Also, what's happening just after this is Gregor Mendel, which you might remember from 7th grade, was the monk studying pea plants, coming up with some of the first ideas about genetics. Okay? His work was kind of forgotten and not rediscovered until the 20th century, actually. So that's sort of the context of these things. So, natural selection. How did Darwin know this? How do we know that species evolve? We have lots of different areas of evidence that tell us species evolve over time. And one of the first types of evidence was the fossil record. People have found fossils for many, many years. And when we study the fossil record, what we find is that 99% of all species that have ever lived on Earth are extinct. They lived at some point in the past and did not survive into modern times. These like the trilobites, dinosaurs. So the trilobite fossil. These are dinosaur tracks that were left in the mud and then eventually covered and solidified into rock. We can also tell by geological radioactive dating, which I'm sure you guys covered last year in Earth Science, the age of the Earth. By looking at the composition of various compounds, we can see that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. It's very old. That provides a very long time span for the evolution of species to take place. Fossils also show us we can find the transitional fossils, fossils that are in between modern forms and their ancestors, things like this. This is Archaeopteryx. We would call this a transitional fossil. It shows us an extinct animal that's sort of in between reptiles and birds. It has bird-like characteristics like feathers, but also has reptile-like characteristics like teeth and a long bony tail, things like that, claws at the end of its wings. So this sort of shows us there's a step between reptiles and birds that we can find in the fossil record. This is the evolution of horses, which I'll show you another more detailed diagram a little bit later, but it shows us we have find the fossils that give us the steps from horses 60 million years ago, which were little dog-like creatures, to modern horses we have today. And we can find fossils of the steps that lead us there. So that's good evidence that these species have changed over time. You can also look at the structures within an organism. We sometimes look at similarities, other times we look at differences between the features. And they can help us understand the ancestry of different species. Sometimes we look at homologous structures. These are structures that are similar between organisms. If I take a human arm and a whale flipper and a wing of a bat, they may, an outward appearance, look completely different. Right? One's an arm, one's a flipper, one is a wing. You wouldn't seem to give much connection. But when we look a little bit deeper and we look at the bone structure that underlies those different parts, we find that it's very similar. They have the same bones and basically the same arrangement. We have the upper arm bone, we have the two ulnar and radius bones of the forearm, we have wrist bones, and then we have finger bones. They're present in all three of these species. So what does this tell us? It tells us probably a common ancestor that had some sort of similar bone structure that they all inherited from it. We could also look at leftover structures, things that seem to have no actual function. For example, in a snake, in the skeleton, there are these tiny little bones that are basically the pelvis and the femur, the leg bones, that are kind of the leftovers from evolution. Because what did snakes evolve from? Yeah, from four-legged reptiles. So over time, through evolution, those four legs have been lost, but inside of the skeleton of that snake, you could still see sort of the remnants of that from its evolutionary past. You could see it in whales. They have these bones that represent sort of hip bones, because as we just saw the other day, whales evolved also from four-legged mammal ancestors. So those vestigial leftover structures can tell us about evolution. We can look at the embryos of different species. Closely related species typically have similar embryonic development. For example, in the early stages, all vertebrates, even mammals, have gill pouches, gill slits, at the early stages of their embryonic development. You'll see there are these sort of lines here. Obviously, humans don't have gills, nor do pigs, but these development, in the internal development of the embryo, these organisms have some similar characteristics. Sort of gives us clues as to their evolutionary past. And obviously, if you look at the pig and the human, they look most similar in their embryonic development, much later into development, versus
The
the
Space Jam
lizard
characters?
or the tortoise. What's that?
They look like the Space Jam characters.
All right, thanks for showing that. Molecular evidence is an excellent tool to understand evolution as well. We know all living organisms share the same genetic code. Series of letters, A's, T's, G's, and C's that make up the genes of all organisms. And so there are also some molecules that are in common between almost all living things, like cytochrome C. Cytochrome C is a protein that's found in every living thing, basically. And so we could look at this molecule and see how it varies from one species to another. If it's very similar, what do you think it means about those two species? Yeah, they have a common ancestor, and it's not too far back that you have to go to find that common ancestor. If we find the cytochrome C molecule is quite different, you'll have to go farther back in the past to find a common ancestor. Okay. And so here's an example of that. So this diagram shows humans compared to all of these other species. And their cytochrome C molecule, how similar is it to other species? So obviously it's closest, so humans, it's identical with other humans, but it's also identical to chimps. Okay. So these are just different species. This is, yeah, that's some sort of protist, I believe. Euglena, for example, is one we do know. So Euglena, a simple photosynthetic protist, its cytochrome C is about 56% similar to humans. So obviously, what this is telling us is that the relatedness between humans and these other species. We can do the same thing with DNA. Yes. We could also do the same with DNA sequences. By studying DNA sequences and comparing them between different organisms, we can tell how closely related they are. All right, so that's evidence we have for evolution. Let's talk about natural selection. What is it? How does it work? So I think we already understand this pretty much, but we'll just go through the basics. So first of all, there's this overpopulation. In any species, more young are born or produced than can survive. They all cannot survive. Otherwise, the world would be overpopulated with all sorts of species. So which ones survive? Well, it depends. They have to compete with each other for this struggle for survival. Because there's variation within the population, some individuals are better able to compete, better able to survive because of the variations they happen to have inherited. And so some survive better than others. If they survive better, they can reproduce more and then pass on these helpful traits, these helpful variations to the next generation. And if you repeat this process generation after generation for thousands or millions of generations, eventually helpful variations become more and more common in the species, and we start to call them adaptations. We have this term we use called selecting agents. The selecting agent in an example of natural selection is what is determining which individuals survive and which don't. Is it food? Is it predators? Okay. Is it the climate? So the selecting agent are the factors that are determining who survives and who doesn't. And so to sort of summarize this, we often will say that evolution works by survival of the fittest. That the best, the organisms, the individuals with the best adaptations survive better, reproduce more, passing them on to the next generation. So if we look at just this as a visual example, we have a population of some sort of a deer or something. There's start with this overpopulation, that there's just more individuals. They're not all going to survive. Okay? There's some variation amongst them, but they're not identical to each other. There's variation in all sorts of ways. Some individuals survive better, survive longer, reproduce more. And when they do, they pass on these helpful traits to the next generation. And this process repeats over and over and over again, leading to the evolution of the species. Other examples. So again, whenever we're talking about these examples, we're talking about what's the variation, what's the struggle, and what's happening with their survival. So giraffes. All right. So giraffes.
Wait, what's the photo?
Oh, we'll get there. I just moved this location. So giraffes evolved from shorter necked ancestors. Okay, you can see some of them here. Obviously today giraffes have extremely long necks. So the struggle for giraffes, first, the variation was in the length of their neck. That, just like if you were to measure all of our neck lengths, it would vary. We don't all have the same exact length neck. Same thing with animals. But in the giraffes, there was an advantage to having a slightly longer neck. That their food in the trees is more accessible if the neck's a little bit longer. So giraffes that were born with that slightly longer neck could reach higher into the trees, could get more food, could survive times of low food availability, have more energy for reproduction, for finding mates, and passed on that trait to the next generation. Again, repeat generation after generation, and eventually the giraffe population had longer and longer necks. Now, it doesn't mean that a giraffe was born with a mutation and its neck went from 4 feet long to 20 feet long. These changes often build up gradually. Even having a couple centimeter longer neck would still give an advantage to that giraffe. It would still get a little bit more food and be able to survive a little bit better. So it doesn't have to happen in like a sudden change. It happens often very gradually over time. And you can see that in the giraffes. The peppered moths, maybe you remember from 7th grade. Peppered moths, their variation is in their coloration. Some are lighter, some are darker. And when the population, the environment changed due to the Industrial Revolution, and trees became darker in color because of soot, because lichens were destroyed, the darker form, the darker variation had a advantage. It survived better because predators had a more difficult time finding it. They survived longer, survived better, reproduced, pass on the darker variation to their offspring, and over time the entire population of peppered moths shifted into a darker variety. Bacteria. We know when that bacteria, even though they reproduce asexually, they still have variations within individual bacteria, often due to mutations. So if you take a population of bacteria and treat it with some antibiotics to kill the bacteria, well, at first, some of these bacteria might have very low resistance, and they die very easily when they're exposed to the antibiotic. Others might have a medium level of resistance. But there might be some that have a variation in which they're more highly resistant. And so if we treat this original population with antibiotic, we kill off these bacteria that died very easily. There could be remaining some bacteria that were resistant. And so if you have strep throat and you get an antibiotic prescription, you take it, and the first day you're killing off the least resistant bacteria. They die easily. And then the second and third day, you're killing off these bacteria. And maybe your throat starts to feel better because most of the bacteria have been killed off. So you stop taking the antibiotic. Well, what you've done basically, you selected for the highest resistant bacteria. If you stop taking it, they can start to reproduce and the infection can return. But this time, it's a stronger infection. It's not going to be as easily treatable with antibiotics. So that's why doctors are more careful today about prescribing antibiotics and being sure patients take all of the prescription and so forth to try to reduce the incidence of resistant bacteria. There are some bacteria that have evolved to be resistant to just about every antibiotic that we have. They're very dangerous. Sometimes they're called superbugs because they're resistant. And so if you get an infection with one of those resistant bacteria, it can be dangerous because we don't really have good antibiotics to treat. So in this case, the selecting agent is the antibiotic selecting which bacteria are going to live, which are going to die. So people sometimes ask the question, does natural selection still work on humans? Well, I don't know. You could say yes, you could say no. This picture from the Star Curious pool party this summer. And so luckily, tragedy was avoided. There's no problems at this pool party, but if there was, I could say natural selection will work. Die. All right. Let's watch this quick video because we're going to talk about speciation, how new species come about. So speciation is this way new species come about. So oftentimes species diverge and split, and one species can split off and become two. And that process is called speciation. Often this happens when a group gets separated. One existing population gets separated into two groups. And then if those two groups cannot reproduce with each other anymore, they each can take slightly different pathways through evolution. Because they've been geographically isolated, the conditions might be favoring different traits. And so as they start to evolve differently, they start to become different from each other. They can eventually become so different that they're actually different species. That if they were to come together again, they actually wouldn't breed with each other anymore. And then then a new species has come about. There was an interesting experiment that Diane Dodd did at Yale University in the late 80s. What she did is she was experimenting with fruit flies. And she took a population of fruit flies and she divided them into two groups and kept them isolated from each other. but she treated each of the groups differently. One group was fed only a maltose solution for food. The other group was fed only a starch solution for food. And she kept them apart. They reproduced for several generations in their isolated areas. And then after several generations, she allowed them to come back together. These two groups have been separated for a period of time. What she found is that the starch-eating fruit flies only mated with other starch-eating fruit flies. And the maltose-eating fruit flies only mated with other maltose-eating fruit flies. Basically, this is an example of speciation. Because that's our definition of species. Organisms which can reproduce and produce young. And so this initial species has now formed two separate species because they were isolated and they took different pathways, evolutionary pathways. So we can actually see speciation happen in that example in just a short period of time. Now there are different ideas about how quickly evolution takes place. One idea is gradualism, where just species change a little bit at a time, slowly, over the years, gradually. And the other concept is this concept of punctuated equilibrium, where species stay relatively stable, and then something prompts a large change in the species in a rapid period of time. And then they stay stable, and then a rapid change. So there's two sort of ways that could happen. We know also that species become extinct. If there variations in the group do not allow the species to tolerate the conditions they're in, predators that they have, changes in climate, then species can become extinct. And what we often see is that when a group of organisms becomes extinct, it kind of opens up space for other organisms to evolve and fill that space. Oh, here's an example. So extinction. These are horses. These are horses from 60 million years ago. They were little dog-like creatures. They had 4 toes. They don't look much like horses we know today. Over 60 million years, they evolved to be larger and larger. Their toes were reduced in number from 4 to 3 to 2 to none. Basically, a hoof is like 1 toe. And so the yellow pathway you see is the pathway that led to modern horses. Like you could trace modern horses back to these ancestors. But if you look along the way, all these species in white are species that went extinct. So evolution doesn't happen sort of like a pathway going towards some goal in the end, making horses. There are all these side branches with things that didn't work out, species that did not survive into modern times. So it's very complicated. And so this concept of adaptive radiation is that we have periods when many new species emerge because new opportunities have sort of opened up in the environment. An example, when dinosaurs went extinct, do you know what type of animals was able to sort of flourish and become many different types of species? No? The dinosaurs weren't really
Mammals.
mammals. There was huge adaptive radiation in mammals after dinosaurs became extinct. Or another example, Galapagos finches. When the ancestral species, some of you are still writing that, when the ancestral finch migrated to the Galapagos Islands, and those islands were filled with these new finches, they were able to form many different species through adaptive radiation and speciation. These are all the finches that you can find on the Galapagos Islands. All right, we'll talk about artificial selection another time.